Good afternoon. Welcome to the Rancho Mirage Public Library. In my humble opinion, this is the most important lecture series, 2 lectures by Penny Rivin, that we do all year. We thank you for coming. How many of you were here yesterday? Aha. So you heard me say yesterday that I funded this series. No applause. It's only a message that it's not that hard to do. You come to us and you say, gee, I'd really like to fund that topic or that history lecture or that natural science lecture. We'd be happy to speak to you. We are yours truly, David Bryant, Library Director, and Susan Cook, our Principal Librarian. We're readily available. We live here practically, so you can usually find us. And we're pretty nice to deal with, and the costs are not going to alter your retirement or the car that you purchase next. I can assure you of that. One quick thing, this is the library's 20th anniversary. This building, we're celebrating 10 years, and we've just done some major changes of carpeting and color, et cetera, that you may have noticed. But in 20 years, it's pretty remarkable. We've had 5 million people through the Rancho Mirage Public Library. Guess how many books and DVDs, et cetera, we have checked out in 20 years? A large number. Well, that gentleman is right on track. 9 million. 9 million. And only 17,000 people live here. So they're reading constantly, and they're relying on us. We've had 15,000 programs in 20 years, too. So we're pretty proud of all that. And for those of you who heard about the gold card today and might like to get one, if you live in Rancho Mirage, we will provide you with a gold card. It's yours. Carry it with pride. And what it does is it gets you into these programs a little bit before the people who don't live in Rancho Mirage. We welcome the people who don't live here. And if you want to be gold card holders, it's $100 gift to the Library Foundation, as mentioned on the front of this lectern, and you will then get a gold card as well. So that's what the gold card is all about. So it is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you Penny Rivin, who is a former professor. She is a former CNN Middle East correspondent. She is fluent in Arabic, and she is very wise about the ways of Islamic terror. And as I mentioned yesterday, in my humble opinion, that is the most important topic facing us globally at this time. Please welcome Penny Rivin.
Well, I'm glad so many of you came back, that you were here yesterday. I thank you very much for coming. Certainly thank David Bryant, Rancho Mirage Library, for inviting me, the city of Rancho Mirage, and especially you for being interested in this very tough topic, difficult topic, that I think we all need to understand a little bit better. I title my talks this year, Terrorism, the Roots, which we talked about yesterday, the rise of Muhammad as a warrior. None of this would have been possible. The Islamic religion would not have survived had Muhammad not been such a successful warrior. He invented, as those of you who were here yesterday heard me say, he invented what we call modern insurgency warfare. And today I want to talk, so that was the roots of terrorism. Today I want to talk about the legacy, the terrorism that we face, modern terrorism, and give you some sort of a framework so that you can work it out when you start to hear the news and all these various things. There's just one thing I want to say before I get started in my talk. There was a woman from Chicago who came up to me yesterday and asked some questions about the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you happen to be in the audience today, please come back up before you leave if you have time, because I have something I'd like to tell you or inform you about. So that's the woman from Chicago who asked about the Quran and the Dead Sea Scrolls. It has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about now. All right, let's see what I'm going to talk about now. Terrorism, the legacy. Well, clearly the 20th century was the American century. Most of us are well aware of that. And we're well aware of the fact that the United States has not declared war since World War II. But here we are. We find ourselves in the 21st century engaged in a war. But it's a new kind of war. And it's a war up to now that's undeclared. And it's a war against a stateless, morphing, floating enemy, the terrorists. To paraphrase Mark Twain, it's not what you don't know that does you in. It's what you're convinced you do know that sends you down the wrong path time after time. And despite what you've been told, terrorists are not all one size fits all. It's the belief that we face a single enemy that's the problem. We need to understand terrorist groups individually. Now, there are some things they hold in common. Yes, all terrorist organizations are energized by faith. Each terrorist group represents power, often with a global agenda. The various terrorist groups are the products of modernization, westernization, and globalization. They all want to eliminate moderation. They all want to push the West into war. They are plotting to punish their enemies through revenge or vendettas. They all plan to destabilize the United States in one way or another. They all want to destroy the state of Israel, and many of them want their own state. Now, ISIS is the flavor of the month, but there are countless other terrorist organizations with various agendas. For example, Al-Qaeda is making a comeback. Some of you who were at my talk last year remember that I said with ISIS rising so and considering Al-Qaeda irrelevant, that could very well force Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations to reinvent themselves and come back even stronger. And what we see today is the spin-offs of Al-Qaeda, but nevertheless they're part of the Al-Qaeda group. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen, and Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. Maghreb is an Arabic word that means the West, and that's Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb is Al-Qaeda in the western part of Africa. It was Mali, recently it was Burkina Faso. And remember, never lose sight of the fact that terrorism is theater. Terrorists want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. They don't care if you die, but the object is to make sure you watch. And so we film it, they put their films, their videos on social media, because terrorists want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. So let's break it down. We're going to talk about the three big Sunni terrorist groups. Later, I'll talk about the one Shiite group, Hezbollah. But let's start with the big three, the Sunni groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda and the spin-offs, and the Taliban. The Taliban is the greatest threat to the people in its vicinity. The Taliban works to establish a Sunni ultra-Orthodox society in Afghanistan and in the border areas of Pakistan. Al-Qaeda's objective is to eliminate the state of Israel and destroy the United States. The objectives of ISIS are to establish a caliphate, punish the apostates, those are the Muslims who leave the faith, and eliminate the infidels. These are not multicultural groups. Only Sunnis are allowed in. Now, all terrorists wage jihad, a holy war. In Islamic law, Jihad means an armed struggle for Islam against infidels and apostates. The central element of a jihad is that the Islamic community, the Ummah, the Islamic community, under the leadership of a caliph, Khalifa, the successor to Muhammad, the caliph has a duty to expand Islamic rule, that is, Sharia law. And they have the duty to expand Sharia law until the whole world is conquered. Jihad is a Muslim's duty. Land occupied by Muslims is known as Dar al-Islam, which means the land of Islam, and all other land not controlled by Islam is known as Dar al-Harb, the land of war. If infidels attack the land of Islam, the soil of Islam, it's the duty of all Muslims who live in that land to resist, and the duty of all Muslims who live outside of the Muslim land that was attacked to assist the Muslims who live there in defeating the infidels. In waging jihad, all infidel males, except for slaves and monks, are legitimate targets. Infidel women and children are legitimate targets if they support the enemies of Islam. The enemies of Islam can be attacked without regard for collateral damage, and it is permitted to kill women or children in a night raid if the Muslim fighters cannot distinguish the women or the children from the men fighting them. No exceptions are made for civilians. Regrettably, experts initially insisted that Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the Taliban were in effect a single unified enemy. This type of misinformation has helped create the very problems we're struggling with today. By failing to recognize the fundamental political and cultural differences between ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and others, Western ignorance about the terrorists has drawn the terrorists closer together. They sort of believe the enemy of my enemy is my friend. To illustrate, the Taliban was originally, when it was formed, an inward-looking, brutally conservative local Afghan movement for Afghanistan. It was not Arab. The Afghans are not Arabs. They're Muslims, but they are not Arabs. The Taliban governed using a very literal interpretation of the Quran. The Taliban leaders sought to seal Afghanistan off from the outside world. The Taliban initially had no global agenda. Well, contrast this with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has no roots in any one country, and Al-Qaeda is made up of mostly Arabs. And unlike the Taliban, Al-Qaeda is motivated by a desire to unify the Ummah, the Muslim community of the world. Al-Qaeda, right from the beginning, had a global agenda. Al-Qaeda and later spin-offs of Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, were preparing a worldwide jihad, specifically against the West, the United States, and the State of Israel. Initially, there was very little in Al-Qaeda or in the Taliban teachings that united them, and a whole lot that separated them. But the misunderstandings on the part of the Western world transformed the Taliban into the hardened, belligerent, ideologically driven group we see today, and shoved the Taliban leaders much closer to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. For example, there's very little left of the original Al-Qaeda as founded in 1989 by Osama bin Laden and others, and it was founded in the wake of the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. The face of Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, is dead. Bin Laden's successor, a very uncharismatic, reclusive Egyptian surgeon, Ayman Zawahiri, is described by other terrorist leaders as completely irrelevant. What is left of bin Laden's al-Qaeda movement is somewhere probably in the tribal regions of Pakistan. But there's very little cause to celebrate. Rather than eliminating al-Qaeda, Western miscalculations contributed to al-Qaeda reinventing itself. Today, al-Qaeda has morphed into several different terrorist groups, most notably ISIS, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen, al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Western Africa, al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda spin-off in Syria, al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria, that's the group that has kidnapped so many young girls and carried them off in Nigeria. And there are large numbers of sympathizers in Europe and in Australia, as well as other places. And nearly 15 years after 9/11, numerous jihadi groups are still in business. So who are they? And how, despite vast international efforts, how has this happened? Well, it's tempting and much easier to regard all violence involving terrorists as expressions of a single conflict. But if we do that, we're making a major mistake. The extremist-fueled violence across Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and a lot of other countries. Sometimes people include France, the UK, and Indonesia, and Burkina Faso. Of course, they involve the teachings of radical Islam, but each of these movements has its own local roots, its own local causes, its own dynamics, and participants. The only common denominator is Wahhabi extreme teachings of Islam and Wahhabi Saudi financing. The Saudis are the bankers of international Sunni terrorism. People looking for insight into terrorist strategy would do well to read a book published in 2004 in Arabic and translated into other languages, including English, in 2006. And the book is disturbingly titled, The Management of Savagery. This book discusses a world in which the United States has disappeared and the Muslim world has descended into savagery. This book is a frightening handbook for violence, embraced by ISIS and its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. You can pull this book up online, free, you don't have to buy it. It's in a very flowery English because it was translated from Arabic directly into English. And Arabic is a very flowery language, so it's actually sort of boring reading as you go through it. But if you're interested, The Management of Savagery, it's written by a fellow who calls himself Abu Bakr. Those of you who have been to enough of my lectures know that name signifies something. It's his pen name, Abu Bakr Naji, N-A-J-I. And it's a very frightening handbook, certainly used by ISIS, a how-to manual for violence and managing savagery. But what I found positive in this book is that in its gruesome practice, this savage approach advocates so much brutality and bloodshed that it's going to, I think, alienate ordinary Muslims, like the Jordanians, the people who live in the United Arab Republics and elsewhere. And we see this is probably happening because it's apparent in this sort of fledgling coalition of Muslim nations trying to join together to fight terrorists, especially ISIS. This book, The Management of Savagery, has a plan to draw the United, if you read it, the plan of the book is to draw the United States deeper and deeper into a conflict throughout the Muslim world. The author is convinced that the United States is a paper tiger and that the American people are going to be drained by a long war in Muslim countries, they're also going to be drained by all their social problems back home here in the United States. According to this theory in the Management of Savagery, the key to undermining American power is raw violence. The more shocking, the better. It isn't just that violence will expose Western weaknesses, it's that violence against infidels is going to force Muslims who are on the fence to make a choice. The Management of Savagery glorifies two very early caliphs who came after Muhammad. They burned apostates to death in city squares because these early caliphs knew the effect this would have on the public. The book encourages publicly slaughtering infidels because violence is very effective in managing non-believers. Look at the Paris attacks, November 2015. One of the terrorists shouted before he died, "Hollande's foreign infidel policy is to blame." Another terrorist, while spraying gunfire in one of the restaurants, shouted, "This is for Syrian Muslims." Additional attacks in at least 6 locations were a kind of vicious subplot with the dual purpose of spreading terror as well as being a diversionary tactic so that they could confuse the French security forces and keep them running in several different directions at the same time. And then there's San Bernardino. Obviously not a major terrorist operation, but clearly more than a 2-person or a 1-location only job at its inception. And no matter what terrorist group we look at, there is no such thing as a lone wolf operation. Terrorist attacks, no matter how large, no matter how small, all terrorist attacks are coordinated. This frequently involves teamwork. A terrorist attack can require months of preparation, precise intelligence, a variety of weapons, and it must have dedicated killers backed by organizations, and most of all, reliable financing. Before the attack, the terrorist helpers, those who help the terrorists carry out the attack, they become familiar with the movements and the placement of any and all security forces in the area where the terrorists are going to go. They become aware of any cameras, any videos. A terrorist organization always has drivers, people who will drive the terrorists to the attack and then wait to whisk them away from the attack site. They also photograph the attacks. The helpers of the terrorists always photograph the attack. Remember, terrorism is at its core theater. Terrorists don't want a lot of people dead. They want a lot of people watching. That's their main objective, to have a lot of people watching and become scared to death. At the top, there's always an elite command group that raises money, plans the attacks, directs and coordinates everything. These elite command groups enlist operatives and maintain communications between the different teams. It's believed that at least 200 operatives at various levels were involved in the Paris attacks and were directly involved in at least 2 months of advance planning before the Paris attacks. Much of this is possible because European cities frequently have isolated Muslim neighborhoods where Sharia law rules. These communities do not recognize the infidel systems in which they live. Throughout the UK and Europe, especially France, when police are forced to enter these Muslim neighborhoods, they often enter with armed military escorts, and they sport automatic rifles. Widespread with crime, poverty, and deprivation, these disenfranchised Muslim communities have become very sophisticated terrorist networks. Another terrorist approach is to have a lot of small attacks. Killing is not so crucial. Just keep the infidels off guard and frightened. Small-scale attacks mixed with several big attacks to really keep infidels anxious furthers a terrorist cause. And then you can always bring in the full-blown terrorist attacks to do as much damage as possible. But as terrible as all this sounds, counterterrorism experts tell me, and they also believe, that this book is way too esoteric, way too deep to have a very wide following among the masses of uneducated, illiterate Arab populations, Muslim populations. For terrorists, the decline of the Muslim societies, where you have so many illiterate, uneducated people, especially through the centuries, for terrorists, this is a direct result of Western infidel intervention in Muslim lands. And Islam is the cure. For terrorists, whether Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others, Sharia law is the only solution. And I think we need to face the grim truth. There is no evidence whatsoever that Islam and Sharia law is ever going to be compatible with modern democracy. From Afghanistan under the Taliban to Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, from Iran to Sudan, there is no Islamic entity that is in any way close to being democratic. And again, to quote the Prime Minister of Turkey, "There are no modifiers in Islam," he said. "Islam is Islam. Democracy is merely the train it rides to accomplish its goals." Well, so far we've discussed the Sunni groups. What about the Shiites? What about Hezbollah? Well, this is quite a different organization. It's different in structure, purpose, in long-term scenarios, very different than the Sunni groups, but it's just as deadly. Hezbollah means Party of God. Hezbollah is a Shiite, militant, political party based in Lebanon. Hezbollah is a state within a state. Hezbollah's military in Lebanon is more powerful than the Lebanese army. The enemy for Hezbollah is Israel. The acknowledged sponsor of Hezbollah is Iran. Hezbollah is the only terrorist group officially backed by a nation state. No Sunni group, not ISIS, not Al-Qaeda, not the Taliban. They don't have an official backing from any one country. Hezbollah is the only terrorist group officially backed by a state, Iran. Hezbollah denies the Holocaust and promotes anti-Semitic conspiracy theories all the time. The United States, France, the Gulf Arabs, Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, Israel, they all classify Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. But early in 2015, early last year, the United States removed Hezbollah from its list of active terror threats against the United States, because intelligence experts believe that Hezbollah does not present a direct threat to the United States as does Al-Qaeda and certainly ISIS or perhaps the Taliban. So early in 2015, the U.S. removed Hezbollah from its list of active terrorist threats against the U.S., but the United States continues to identify Hezbollah, the organization, as a terrorist group. And in reality, the Lebanese Shiites are Hezbollah. Hezbollah received $400 million or so from Iran. United States estimates are that Iran has been giving Hezbollah $60 to $100 million per year for a long time. Other estimates are as high as $200 million a year from Iran to Hezbollah. Hezbollah also relies on financing from the worldwide Shiite Lebanese communities in West Africa, the United States, and most importantly, from the Triple Frontier or tri-border area along Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. It's believed that Hezbollah uses Venezuela and Venezuelans to launder money, with the current president, Maduro's, personal approval. Lebanese Shiites see Hezbollah as more than an army, however. The Lebanese Shiites see Hezbollah as a political movement and as a social services provider. Because Hezbollah organizes an extensive social development program throughout Lebanon, especially in the south. Hezbollah runs hospitals, news services, educational facilities. Hezbollah's reconstruction campaign is responsible for numerous economic and infrastructure development projects in Lebanon, especially after the war with Israel. Hezbollah has set up a Martyrs Institute that provides living and education expenses for families of fighters who die in battle. Hezbollah currently operates at least 4 hospitals, 12 clinics, 12 schools, and 2 agricultural centers throughout Lebanon. Hezbollah has an extensive social assistance program. Hezbollah's medical care is cheaper than in private Lebanese hospitals, and it's free for any Hezbollah member. In other words, Hezbollah is doing everything a government should do, from collecting the garbage to running hospitals and repairing the schools. But the dark side remains. In 2005, former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, Sunni, was killed when his motorcade was struck by a roadside bomb in Beirut. Strong evidence links Hezbollah to his murder. Clearly, there is Hezbollah involvement in attacks on Israelis, in attacks on Jews, clearly in the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, and in the Iraq and Syrian civil wars. The Hezbollah Manifesto of 1985 states very clearly, "We in Hezbollah are the sons of the Muslim community. We are linked to the Muslims of the world by our solid connection to Islam, whose message God ordered through the Prophet Muhammad. Our culture is based on the Quran and on Sharia law." And counterterrorism experts warn that Hezbollah could attack Europe at any time without warning. But 2 factors should be encouraging. First, come on, the West and Israel are not so exhausted that our resolve and our power has evaporated. And second, most Muslim states with little public opposition seem as disgusted by the ultra-violence of the various terrorist groups and say they're ready to join a coalition to fight the terrorist groups. So who do we believe? Who do we pay? Who do we join with? Who do we ask to join with us? The talk now being bantered around, certainly in politics among the various candidates running for office, but always by the government, about war. We're going to war against the terrorists. All right, let's think about this a minute. So, should we go to war against a terrorist group? Well, if you're going to go to war, you need to consider some things. Historically, the objective of any war was for resources, influence, and land. And today, of course, is for religion. Modern warfare involves far more than traditional methods, because warfare in the 21st century is also psychological warfare. And modern warfare uses sanctions and the media, especially the social media, The social media is used to promote aggressive intimidation. And if a nation is going to war, 3 things are essential. First, you need an operational strategy imposing costs on the enemy. You also need the presence of high-quality allies and friends backing you up, covering your back. And third, the role of value. Your enemy has to understand that you are going to defend your interests, because this will often deter others from becoming allies of your enemy. They just go, I'm not joining with you because I don't want the wrath of the United States or Israel. So I'm sorry, I can't back you in this. So the role of value is very important. Your enemy's got to understand you're going to defend your interests no matter what, and you hope this will deter anyone else from fighting on the side of your enemy. But if you decide to go into a war, you always have to have an entrance plan, a battle plan, and an exit plan. Entrance plan, battle plan, exit plan. These were lacking in the Iraq invasion, big time. Step 1, entering a conflict. Entering a conflict is easy, but you need a step 2. After you enter the conflict, then what? And the most important step is the 3rd step, or the last step, and that is the exit plan. It is very hard to get out of a conflict. You must have an off-ramp. And all of this needs to be decided before you get into the conflict. Yes, it's misleading to lump, as many in the media and politics do, all Islamic groups together. Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, Al-Shabaab, Islamic Jihad, Boko Haram, Hamas, ISIS, and the Taliban, and the Muslim Brotherhood. These are all very different and often in competition with each other and within their own ranks. Nonetheless, all of these groups do belong to the same family tree. Each is rooted in fanatical Islam, either Sunni, Wahhabi, surreptitiously financed by Saudi Arabia, or radical Shiite Islam interpretations openly sponsored by Iran. And as I think most people in this room realize, it took generations to reach this all-time low. And it's going to take a very long time to recover, most of the 21st century. And I can assure you, it's going to get a lot worse before it really gets bad. But fortunately, happily, up to now, the combination of a moderate majority of civilians in most places, good police work, good intelligence work, and the incompetence of terrorists in many instances has kept the death toll from terror attacks surprisingly low. But with ISIS as a serious threat, governments have to develop innovative programs to prevent terrorism from spreading. And it all seems a bit overwhelming. But frustrated diplomats I know, intelligence officers, and especially Israelis always tell me, don't lose heart. Because although you cannot buy the loyalty of any group in the Middle East, you can always rent it. Thank you. Thank you very much.